This is the Bitcoin Made Simple podcast. Here's your host, Corey Tusick.
This is the Bitcoin Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Corey Tusick. On today's episode, I interviewed Alex Gladstein. Alex is from the Human Rights Foundation, and you've probably seen him online talking about Bitcoin on Twitter, and he has a couple articles. He writes for Bitcoin Magazine as well. So I wanted to talk to him originally about the Petrodollar article that he wrote. If you haven't checked it out, it's on Bitcoin Magazine, and I'll put the links to his articles in the show notes. But yeah, check out his article about the petrodollar and see how, when we went off the gold standard, then we kind of made our dollar backed by oil in Saudi Arabia, and all the kind of conflicts. It gets into all the conflicts of, interest in how, whether or not it's good to be for us to be a part of that. And also how it, is kind of going away at the moment. And then, how Bitcoin can kind of, provide hope and for a peaceful transition to something that isn't the petrodollar. So I really appreciated Alex coming on. This one's a little bit shorter than usual. It's kind of my fault because I had something run over and I had to push our time back a little bit. So, and Alex had a hard out. So we got about 40 minutes in good conversation. So I hope you guys like it and enjoy it. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast and also follow me on Twitter at Bitcoin Simply. And if you have any questions or comments, just send an email to bitcoinmadesimplepodcast@gmail.com. I hope you enjoy the show. So thanks for coming on. I got Alex Gladstein, Chief Strategy Officer of the Human Rights Foundation. And I came across you, probably a year or so ago, but then once I read your article about the petrodollar in Bitcoin Magazine, I was like, all right, we got to talk. And then I think the message I sent you was when you were talking to Preston, he said something about China and the Genocide Olympics, and I was like, okay, I like this guy. I gotta talk to him. So thanks for coming on, Alex.
Sure, thanks for having me.
So I got to ask, to give a little background to the audience about I'm sure a lot of them have read the article, the petrodollar, but how did you start getting into that story? I mean, I know it's something that you're probably aware of, but you've probably been working on that for a while, I assume, and it's something, a lot of information that a lot of us don't really even know about.
Sure. Well, actually, I was pointed in the direction of researching the foundation of the dollar system, actually through Bitcoin, and the criticisms that people levy at Bitcoin with regard to its energy use. And, I was kind of like, well, what does our current system rely on? And I just started to dig a little bit. And there's a lot of folks in the space who've correctly pointed out that it's not like when you swipe your Visa card at the store to buy something that's like settled at that fintech layer. That's like on top of a banking layer, which is on top of the US government and the way that it produces money, the way that it controls money, et cetera. And that relies on the global demand for the dollar in many ways. So I started to dig into it, and, I knew some monetary history, but I learned a lot more. And, basically the story is, the world used to use gold as the method to settle balance of payments issues between countries, let's say, in modern history. And that has evolved. And that evolved after 1944 to using the US dollar to do balance of payments, pegged at $35 per ounce of gold through the Bretton Woods system. And then that collapsed in 1971 when Nixon closed the gold window. And ever since then, after a period of sort of brief instability, the world has sort of used, for lack of a better word, the treasury bill as the reserve currency of the world. Even today, about 60% of all foreign exchange reserves are held in dollars, actually. So that transition was very interesting to me. And in that context, I'd heard a lot about the petrodollar, but there's not a whole lot of it like on the internet, right? I had to really dig into a lot of like
I was going to
books.
say, it's not something you could like Google, like.
Well, I mean, yeah, it's kind of weird. There's a lot of like fringy theories and things like that. And it took me a while to dig through it and kind of piece it together. But actually it's like a well-known topic in international relations. It just isn't discussed as much now. It was discussed a lot in the 1970s when it happened, and it was discussed to a certain extent in the 80s. But ever since then, the topic of the petrodollar and petrodollar recycling, which is the key mechanism that I want to detail, essentially has fallen off the map. And I guess there's two camps: the larger camp, the common knowledge camp. Almost everybody believes that basically after Nixon closed the gold standard, that the world kind of coalesced around the Treasury as like the thing to save in, and that this was like a market-driven thing because the U.S. was like the most stable or largest economy, etc. I mean, this is essentially what most people believe. But when you dig into it, you realize that there was a lot of really interesting events that happened between 71 and 75, that most notably relating to the United States and Saudi Arabia. So very briefly, the Arab oil exporting nations of OPEC really came into power. In the 60s, they had like basically started this effort to decolonize and nationalize, and the governments of these mostly dictatorships, they kind of seized control over how to dig up and export the oil. And they used this as a weapon, obviously, in 73 in response to U.S. food policy and to our support for Israel in the Yom Kippur War. And the price of oil went from like $3 to like $11 in like from the end of 73 to early 74, like in a period of like 3 months. So this gave them like a seriously insane amount of wealth. Like basically they 10x'd their surplus in a year. And they had more surplus in terms of balance of payments as a collective than the United States, than the entire industrialized world. And the LDCs, or like the developing countries, had debt, right? Had major debt, right? So there were hundreds of billions of dollars of this of these petrodollars between the mid 70s and early 80s, when the oil prices started to tail off. That really changed the world. And there's a couple things. Oil kept going. It got all the way up to like $39 per barrel, right? By the end of that decade. We were in the Cold War, right? So, the incentives for the US and the other European countries, to cooperate were not zero. Even though like the US may have been pursued some policies that were a little adversarial or hegemonic, what were the other allies in our, what were they really going to do? I mean, so we had a kind of interesting
boxed into a corner.
Yeah, we kind of had an interesting context there. Ironically, the Europeans were much more dependent on oil from the Middle East than we were, like about 50% for a lot of those European countries. The U.S. could pursue a little bit more of a self-sufficiency or Western hemispheric approach. And that's kind of what gave Kissinger the confidence to go out and do what he did. So basically, after Nixon closed the gold window, the dollar devalued by 10%. By summer of 73, the dollar had fallen by 20% against other major currencies. So we had a massive inflation issue. And that was really concerning to people who held U.S. debt, obviously, right? You don't want to see your savings dwindle like that. So in order to finance Vietnam and our social programs and everything else we do over here, the solution was to sell bonds, basically. And they hired a bond salesman. So the new Treasury Secretary, William Simon, was a bond salesman, came in from the private sector. And he and Kissinger, between the summer of 73 summer 74 and the end of that year, basically ironed out the petrodollar recycling pact. A petrodollar is just dollars that are earned by an oil exporter in exchange for oil. And the idea was that the Saudi side of the bargain, which would extend to the other OPEC countries largely through their leadership, given that they were the swing producer of oil, was that they would denominate sales in dollars. You had to buy the oil with dollars. And they would take the profits and plow that back into U.S. debt. Okay. On our side, the U.S. side, and that agreement was actually in paper, and it was secret. It was classified, and only parts of it were declassified in the 90s.
And that was just a secret agreement to.
It was a secret because the U.S. was not supposed to be pursuing a unilateral approach with oil producers. It was supposed to be working in concert with like other European nations and other allies. There was
the
also
countries got to love us. They got to love us.
Yeah, there was also the Saudis didn't really want it to be that well known because that would have caused them PR issues in the Islamic world, given the whole U.S. Israel thing. So there were like reasons why the Saudis in the U.S. wanted this kind of on the low down. The non-secret part was obviously what they got in return was obvious to the whole world. I mean, we sold them an enormous amount of weapons. So their weapon sales went from like 5-10 million or something like that to like hundreds of millions of dollars a year in 74, 75. They became a non-market actor when it came to weapon sales. Let's put it that way. They were a market actor before, and then they were not afterwards. So this whole thing is a story of like this being a political pact and a non-market decision, right? This was not like the Saudis just being like, oh, we want to invest in U.S. treasuries. No. This was like a political pact that created the petrodollar. So we assured their security, sold them weapons in exchange for them selling oil in dollars and recycling that money back into U.S. treasuries. And again, this is contra the common economic belief or interpretation, which is that the oil exporter income was lent out through Eurodollar banks to LDCs. Okay, so these Eurodollar banks, which really started in the 50s and 60s as a Cold War kind of ability for kind of Eastern Bloc nations to have dollar accounts in Europe, it became the destination for a lot of the Saudi wealth, right? Their accounts, right? Outside of the purview of the Fed. And, some of that money did go, to high yielding, emerging market countries. But it was a minority. Most of the wealth went to America, Europe, and then Eurodollar accounts, the majority. Okay. And a lot of that went to treasuries. So this was kind of the deal. And this allowed the US to pursue a very strong hand against the Soviet Union in the Cold War. We could literally print oil. I mean, this is so important, the idea that we at the time we could print the money to buy oil, whereas the Soviets couldn't. They had to they had to get dollars somehow, or they had to dig the oil out of the ground, right? It gave us a massive advantage, which, that's a great externality of this, my opinion. I mean, it's not all bad, right? I mean, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great way to lean on your enemy's weaknesses, and break up the Soviet Union.
Yeah, but I mean, essentially, it really did over time allow us to finance an increasing debt to GDP ratio, which was 25%, 30% at the time. Today, it's 130%, right? So, normally when a country has that kind of ratio, outside investors back out, like the currency devalues, and the country usually starts to pursue more exports, and then it brings it into balance. Like there's this natural balance between having a really strong currency and a really weak currency, usually in international markets. But because there was this like artificial demand for our debt through the Petrodollar Pact, that's where it was all created. We didn't have that balance, so we kind of continued to roll up debt over the decades. We continue to financialize, over leverage. Our percentage of our GDP that's in finance and real estate is now 20%. It was only 10%, back then. So people in certain sectors in America have done really well: finance, defense, technology, services, but in manufacturing, not so well, right? And I think it's important to note that the petrodollar system, which was at the beginning it's really two things that are key here. It's the pricing of oil in dollars, which continues to this day, in which the U.S. government has defended quite aggressively in the last few decades. And it's the recycling piece of it, of putting those profits back into U.S. debt. Now, at the beginning, from the mid 70s to the early 80s, the OPEC countries are what bought our debt. But after the price of oil fell, and especially after the first Gulf War, they blew all their savings, basically. So we needed to find new people to buy our debt. That was the Germans, the Europeans, then it was the Japanese, and then it was the Chinese. So, throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there were different countries that were like our largest purchaser of treasuries. We kind of went through those cycles, and American foreign policy was very, pointed towards making sure we had a buyer of our debt. But the kind of founding part has been aggressively defended, and again, just to be clear, for that first decade, it was part and parcel because we needed the OPEC countries to invest in our debt, give us a lifeline, right? Allow us to print oil, essentially. But later, that was so important because it really had so many other effects. It really made all these other countries around the world need dollars to buy oil, strengthening the currency pair between their currency and the dollar, and it just made the U.S. dollar extremely dominant. Even the British pound was being used for something like 20% of oil trading in the mid 70s, and by 76, 77, that was down to 5%. So it really helped us consolidate control in that way. And the fact that oil is priced in dollars, again, has been defended. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, we didn't have another Bretton Woods. The U.S. didn't say, "Hey, let's come up with a new deal." Actually, every time there was someone came up with another idea, we reacted, right? So in the mid 70s, there was actually talk about an SDR, a special drawing rights, unit of account, kind of like the Bancor that Keynes came up with in Bretton Woods. That would be used as this currency basket to price oil in. And the US actually did another deal with Saudi, where we got Saudi into the IMF, into a position of power there, with the agreement that they would never allow the SDR to become a reserve currency. So that was another kind of cool deal that we did, or nefarious, depending on your position and nationality. And then, the next big challenger was the euro. Of course, we saw, writing was on the wall for this. And there were people who wanted there to be a petro euro instead of the petrodollar, right? So the key actor, obviously, there was Saddam Hussein, priced his oil in euros under the UN Oil for Food program, and was selling about 5% of the world's oil in euros as of 2002. Well, we know where that went. In March 2003, the US invaded Iraq, and by June 2003, they were back to selling oil in dollars again. There weren't any other really major efforts outside of rogue states to price oil in other currencies. And this defeat of this idea of the petro euro bought us a lot more time. And even until the end of the 2010s, the last decade, almost all oil and all the derivatives on top of it were all sort of traded in dollars, I think 99% or something like that. So this petrodollar system is now starting to decline. The Chinese government stopped buying treasuries in 2014, and the whole world's been sort of just hoarding since then. And the U.S. government is now the largest purchaser of our own debt. So that's kind of where we are now. And it will continue to decline. But it really worked very well for the U.S. for 4 decades, at least for the elites in the U.S., the coastal elites, et cetera, the people in power. We had this exorbitant privilege, right? And people got to understand that that's our monetary system, and it's based on oil and the fossil fuel industry. It's based on dictators and a pact with Saudi Arabia. It's based on the military industrial complex and our defense of this pricing system, which led to, for example, what I believe, at least in part, the invasion of Iraq, the destruction of Iraq, and it's based on this financialization of our own economy, whereby like the 1% have really done really well at the expense of the bottom 80%.
Yeah.
So I think that like my interest in exploring this all came about because people are always criticizing Bitcoin's energy use, right? Or like, cost per transaction. And it's like, well, let's actually be fair here and look at the negative externalities. And the dollar is like hugely bad for the environment. I mean, the U.S. military is the world's number one largest purchaser of oil. Mm-hmm. And I just think this is important to think about. Like, we could head in a future direction where the reserve currency that the money system is built on is based on an open, neutral standard that no one government can manipulate. That is very possibly going to head in an extremely, carbon neutral-ish direction, where we already have something like, anywhere from, depending on estimates, 30, 40, 50, 60% of it, even 70% of it during the summer. Bitcoin mining comes from renewables at the moment. Mm-hmm. Given trends in renewable tech and pricing, that's expected to an increase in hydrocarbons, and the price of coal and oil are tied together. So, that this is expected to just become more green in the future, basically. And, if the world reserve currency ends up being something that's like Bitcoin instead of the petrodollar, okay, well, the US doesn't have to support dictators in the Middle East. We, don't have to pursue this kind of inequality exacerbating kind of like economic policy. We no longer have to like go to war to defend, to prop up that currency. Mm-hmm. And the currency itself could be more green. So that's the thesis of the paper, and it's an optimistic paper, I think, because it looks at a future where we can kind of fix some of these things.
No, I agree. It was very made me feel great afterwards. Reading it and like kind of hopeful for the future, and a lot of the things that the media currently doesn't want you to feel. But and one of the things that struck me was, my audience knows this, but I don't think I mentioned it to you. So I'm making a documentary called Searching for Satoshi. Mm-hmm. And I'm not trying to find Satoshi. It's kind of like just the alluring narrative. And the story is basically to like kind of explore the origins of Bitcoin and all that kind of stuff, and find out, why we'll never find Satoshi and why that's important and good.
Great piece on that by Pete Rizzo in Bitcoin Magazine recently.
Yeah,
by the way.
Yeah, I know. I'm like, I got to get in touch with him about that, because we just are like in the beginning stages of pre-production, and
I think he read all of Satoshi's writings.
Yep, which is something I'm in the middle of doing as well. And I saw that article come up, so I read his article, and I was like, all right, I got there's just so much studying you have to do to come into a film, but yeah. So anyway, so my thesis is that we'll never find him, and that's important, and that's a good thing. But whenever I was reading the article, and by reading your article, I'll admit I did read it once, and then I had Guy Swan read it to me.
Props to Guy Swan.
Yeah, exactly. And it just struck me whenever you got to the part talking about how Saddam Hussein was trying to take us off the petrodollar and go to the petro euro, and then like right away we invade his country and hang him, and it's like, mm-hmm. And I was like, all I could think about at that moment was like, well, that is reason number one why we'll never find Satoshi, and why Satoshi was anonymous. Because if you're going to try and
if you're going to challenge this, it's not going to work out so well. And like, obviously, I think at first, like, Satoshi knew what he, she, they, whatever. Satoshi knew what they were doing, but like, it's not like the US government knew in the first few years that this thing was going to be like a challenger to its primacy. That is still not the case probably today, even as it is, $1 trillion asset or whatever.
They should
whatever
know.
Well, here's the thing is that I think American policymakers would be wise to think hard about this, know that it's not stoppable, understand that mining does not control Bitcoin, and try to understand.
Elon should pay attention to that as well.
Yeah, we leave him aside, but look, America's well placed to be very dynamic in a future Bitcoin economy. I mean, we have a ton of the infrastructure, a lot of the smartest people working on the project, a lot of the developers, like a lot of the holdings. None of this gives the government control over it, but I think it puts us in a pretty advantageous position. Look, we are a nation built on the ideas of private property, free expression, like basic freedoms,
speech, and
and
which a lot of the world doesn't have, and I mean, I know you know that.
Yeah, of course, but that those reverberate with Bitcoin's values, and that's not the case for a lot of the world, as you just mentioned. Like 4+ billion people live under authoritarianism, and Bitcoin does not reverberate with the values of the people who rule them. That's not, this idea of sovereignty or private property or free speech is contra to the regimes in Russia, Saudi Arabia, China, etc. So I think it's could be really good for America for at least when I talk about America, I mean the Declaration of Independence, not what happened after. I talk about the ideals of America. And I mean, really, it's to me, it's you got Satoshi and the founding fathers, right, on the one side, or you got Nixon and Kissinger on the other. Who are you going to go with? It's kind of a slam dunk for me.
Yeah. Well, I have to thank specifically you, and Preston, Pish, and then Guy Swan. So Guy said it to me, but whenever you were talking to Preston, you guys talked about patriotism and stuff like that. And Guy, whenever he and I had our first conversation, I brought it up, and I was like, I've been really conflicted because I love America and everything, but when you look at the macro of what's going on around us, it's do I love this? You know what I mean? And Guy, the way he put it to me basically was he was if you don't believe in the ideals, he's you love America. If you don't believe in the freedom and all that you're un-American. You know what I mean? A lot of the things that are happening around us are un-American.
Yeah. And our support for the Saudis is un-American. I mean, so, the amount of corruption, the rotating door between the military and the arms trade and all this stuff, there's a ton of the prison complex, the war on drugs, all this stuff is un-American. If you actually just look at the founding documents of this country, the systematic mistreatment of minorities and the lack of kind of equalities before the law for certain people based on their identity or ethnicity or belief, all this stuff is un-American. If you just read the Declaration of Independence, and you read the Bill of Rights. So I optimistic about a future. I think people would do well to learn more about the way that their own currency works. It's tied into a broader system, again, through the lens of the Cold War, where America kind of established hegemony in different ways. It wasn't just financially, it was also agriculturally. It's very important. We've kind of used the IMF and the World Bank to make all these emerging market countries kind of reliant on us for food imports. Again, these are kind of not market decisions. This is not the free, the free hand of the open market. It's not Adam Smith here. So this is dependency theory. You know what I mean? Some people, even call it neocolonialism or whatever. The point is that there's a lot of discrepancies in market dynamics around the world related to America as a hegemonic power, right? And some of those are good and some of those are bad. And I think people need to look very hard at that. And it's especially absurd for people who don't understand this to be attacking Bitcoin for its energy use or whatever, when they've literally never questioned the energy use of the currency they use today. I mean, forget the banking. I mean, I'm not even talking about the banking system, which uses way more energy than Bitcoin. I'm just talking about what props up the value, of that dollar in your pocket. At the end of the day, it's not just that people want the dollar from a market perspective. It's that the U.S. has designed a policy that has got a lot of negative externalities to make that dollar valuable and wanted, and to drive up demand for it, even though interest rates have been low in recent years. And that's, part of the reason why it's kind of imperial overstretch mode here. What are we going to do? I mean, there's only so far we can go down in rates in terms of, kind of keeping everything going. And, that's led for people to look elsewhere in many ways, like the Chinese, the Europeans, they're not especially excited to buy US debt. That's like,
Yeah.
and they kind of hold it, and they don't sell it all, because that would be really bad, because it makes up a huge percentage of their savings account. But they're moving out of it, and they're moving into other things. Some countries are moving back into gold. A lot of countries are doing more business in their own currency with each other. So this whole system's winding down. And we'll have to see what kind of comes next. There's a lot of different theories, and I think it's quite conceivable that we could have kind of like a Bitcoin standard in the future, where Bitcoin's sort of the ultimate monetary good, but then there's national currencies underneath that, and then there's bank created money underneath that, and then credit underneath that. So I mean, it's not that different of a hierarchy than it was during the gold standard. It's just Bitcoin is not a dumb rock that cannot teleport and is easily centralized. Like a lot of the main issues,
gold can't be stored in your head.
Yeah, a lot of the issues with gold are that it got totally captured by governments. Like it got completely centralized, including by the US, right?
I mean, they stole it from other governments, basically. So.
Yeah, I mean, steal is a debatable word. I mean, maybe I would agree with you, but clearly, yes, the whole Bretton Woods thing was like, let us hold it, and we'll be good stewards of your gold, and we promise to hold the peg. And that was definitely reneged, So that we walked that one back, right? So anyway, I think that there's some interesting upside here. Again, just relating to the environment, relating to human rights, relating to peace, and relating to equality. I mean, those are, what do people care about? Come on. Those are like four of the biggest things. You got peace, we got the environment, we got human rights, we got equality for people, economic equality. It's funny because these are kind of like seen as kind of more progressive values or more left-wing values. And it's kind of funny that I think that Bitcoin will end up bringing a lot of correction to the world and to America in a way that it's funny, because most critics of Bitcoin, there's a lot of libertarians who hate Bitcoin, but like most Bitcoiner critics are kind of on the left. And it's kind of funny that they're attacking something which I think one day will support some of their aims. Yeah. So we'll see. Yeah. But look, at the end of the day, it's for everybody. It's non-discriminatory and neutral. And a lot of people will just use Bitcoin for like an administrative, logistical reason. Literally, they won't care about anything ideologically. It'll just be like the best thing at their disposal. And maybe their bank account got shut down or whatever, they're economically isolated or whatever. I mean, this does not, like, using it does not necessarily conflict with your ideas on how much should the government be involved in the healthcare system. Like, there's a debate there, but like people from all different political stripes are going to use it, just like people from all different political stripes like engage in capitalistic behavior, regardless of whatever. Like there's like the champagne communists and hipster Marxists and whatever. Like,
yeah.
I mean, so you can believe whatever you want to believe, but you're going to logistically, administratively start to be using Bitcoin in the next few years, or you're going to have some sort of passive exposure to it. So that's kind of what I believe.
I agree. And I think, I think one of the beautiful things about Bitcoin is that it takes, like, because we have this polarized world right now where you're in the left camp or the right camp, which is unfortunate for me because I'm in like neither camp. So I don't identify with either of them. And I feel like I'm on an island by myself, just like, I'm not a part of either part, of these fights going on. But but I feel like Bitcoin pulls the good out of, kind of like how you said, like, it highlights a lot of the like ideals that, like the left is really big on. And then the right, it's like, hey, like, look, sovereignty, individualism,
private property.
Yeah. It's like, it kind of like assimilates them into like harmony. And I hope that that's where we head towards. What do you think it's going to take for the US, because I agree with you. If the US, I think if any country wants to become a major player, they should adopt it as their peg. But the US is...
there's so many stages.
I don't know if they peg it, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's going to happen is like some countries are just going to start to add some of it to their reserves. Okay, so their savings, right? So apparently like the Singaporean sovereign wealth fund already has. So it's just going to be this gradual thing where now you're seeing corporations start to put a little bit of on their balance sheet. Okay. As like a long-term inflation hedge. Okay. Well, maybe governments start to do that too. I don't know, 1%, 2%, 5%. That's like the first part of the narrative. And then over time, they may like start to realize that that's really the asset they should be holding. And that may shift to becoming a really large part of their reserves. And at that point, your holdings of it relate to balance of payments and relate to the economic performance of the country. The interesting thing here, though, is that, just to be deep here, is that any country can create, especially in the next 20 to 30 years, but really forever, can issue either new Bitcoin or earn Bitcoin by harvesting natural resources, and especially renewables. And that has not been, you can't just like harvest dollars. Like, so the ability for like Sudan or Ethiopia or the DRC or like Paraguay to like harness hydro or wind or solar to create the world reserve currency is pretty amazing. I mean, it really gives this new idea to this idea of energy independence. So this is something I'm doing, writing a piece on this for my next essay for Bitcoin Magazine. I'm looking at, the humanitarian aspect of Bitcoin and just how, like, obviously it helps as a peer-to-peer payment rail for aid or donations, and goes around corrupt middlemen, but also it can help with this whole sort of dependency thing, where these like LDCs or emerging market countries are like super overly dependent on other nations. So I'm interested in seeing how that all plays out long term.
Yeah, and then I think too. I think it gets around a lot of the hypocrisy of us supporting things that we don't necessarily believe in. Like whenever you how in the US we don't know a lot of the stuff that happens around the world, and give it like a Star Wars reference. Like I remember talking with somebody about, like, on a deep level and a totally nerdy conversation about Star Wars, where we were like, when the Jedi were in charge, like, it's not like it was perfect. Like, there was slavery around the world, like around the galaxy, you know what I mean? Like, we're like, and if you look at the parallels to like our current world, like, if you live in your US bubble, like, it's like, oh yeah, we rid like slavery in the Civil War, like it's gone. The concentration camps that happened in World War II, and we were the victors, and we've solved that. And then I see things like the Uyghurs getting sent off to concentration camps, and I'm like, oh my god, like, why is this being talked about? And like, so I mean, you live on the front lines of that. Like, am I going crazy and missing something here, or is like the media just, and like everybody kind of willfully ignoring the atrocities that we see around the world?
I mean, some media cover it really well. I have friends who are journalists who've been covering what's happening in China.
Not to say bad about everybody, but
it's not. I mean, the quote unquote mainstream media is a conglomeration of things, corporate interests, the individuals themselves, but also the demand, the market. I mean, they are fighting for ratings, right? So they want to do, they want to do what they think will get them higher ratings. Like, so there's a whole like formula there. But in general, certain parts of the world are more interesting than others. I mean, is there any moral reason why we should be, more interested in Israel, Palestine than Armenia, Azerbaijan? I don't know. Like, what aren't all the human lives the same? So there are reasons for that, but obviously Americans are a lot more interested in that than the other one. Now, maybe those reasons make sense because we've been more deeply involved, because we've been funding one side or whatever. But we've also been funding the Azeris. So I mean, they were part of our war and terror thing. So you dig in, and what ends up happening is some parts of the world get a lot of attention and other parts don't. There's been a war. I mean, the war in the DRC in the Congo between 1997, 2003, and even up till now is like should have, morally speaking, been on the front page of all the news, especially as we get all of our freaking, coltan and all the rare minerals that go into our phones and cars and stuff from that country. But it's just very rarely ever like a thing, like no one cares. So there's a lot to be desired there. But in all these places, Bitcoin's going to make an impact. Look at Palestine. Venmo is freezing any sort of donations to those groups out there. It sounds crude, but Bitcoin literally does fix this. Like you can just, if there's a journalist organization or a relief group in Palestine that you want to help, and they have a smartphone, done deal. Local Bitcoins is vibrant in Palestine. Very easy to sell Bitcoin for fiat currency there. You can send any amount of money to anybody with a smartphone and they can cash out. I just think that is a hugely underappreciated piece here. So anyway, maybe we can kind of conclude, with that thought, but I think that people need to appreciate Bitcoin's properties and maybe you won't appreciate them until you need them, I guess is one way of looking at it. Yeah,
I agree. And I think it's one of those things where it's great. It kind of starts with the positive feedback loop of number go up. And then, I had Mike from Bitcoin Beach on, and just hearing how it's helping people there. So hopefully, it continues to help people around the world. And, we won't see things like like you said, the genocide Olympics and the hypocrisy behind all that kind of stuff. It would be great to see, because like on a human level, like you said, all human lives matter. And I think we, on a human to human level, if you take the corporations and the big powers out, we kind of all are on the same page. So, but Alex, well, I know you got to run. So I'll let you go here. But thanks for coming on. Let people know, where they can, check you out and where they can find you and like Bitcoin Magazine, your other stuff.
Yeah, I have a column up at Bitcoin Magazine. You can find me on Twitter at Gladstein, and you can follow the work of the Human Rights Foundation at href.org. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, Alex. Thanks for coming on.
Yep. Thank you.